Great. Well, thank you. It's absolutely splendid to see so many people registered and actually so many turn up as well this afternoon. So that's great for the first one of our 2026 Zoom presentations. I'm most grateful to Simon Martin-Redman as our Senior Vice President for stepping um, in Gordon's illness, and we wish him well. So Simon is known as Mr. Sarawak, as well as being the Vice President of the Royal, and he's actually managed to win a Grand Prix with his exhibit of Sarawak in Lugano in 2022, which is a great night. Those of us there will definitely remember. And very recently, he's won an ABPS award as Ambassador of the Year, which I think is most particularly for his work as president of the Museum of Philately, which is a great on-site online resource for all kinds of philatelic exhibits. If you really want to look at something, and it's free. And Simon's done a great job publicising that. But he's also a director of the Monte Carlo Club and many other organisations around the world. So, Simon, we're very much looking forward to this talk this afternoon. Fascinating question. I don't know whether Mark's going to run a show of hands to see which side of the debate wins, but that would be interesting.
Well, good afternoon. As Senior Vice President of the Royal, one of my jobs is to organise the Zoom presentations. And a week before Christmas, I'm sitting in the Palladium Panto when my phone buzzes in my pocket, and it was Gordon from California, apologising that he couldn't do today's presentation. He's been a little poorly and didn't felt he could give you his best today. And as it was the week before Christmas, I didn't feel it was right to ask someone at very short notice to do it. So when I gave the Stuart Roster lecture in 2024, unfortunately, it wasn't recorded or went out on Zoom. And a lot of people have said to me since then, they're sorry they missed it. So it was a good chance to take it off the shelf, dust it down, and repeat it today. So the title of the Stuart Roster lecture that I gave in 2024 was Postal History, which is more interesting, the postal aspect or the history aspect. Some of you have seen the next slide before, but so for those who've seen before, I've been collecting stamps since I was 2 years old. It's a charming little picture of me, age 2, and in my left hand is a stamp album. So yeah, I've been collecting a long time. I first got thinking about this lecture after reading a letter in the London Philatelist from a chap called Alan Spence, who said that postal history, saying that judges in postal history exhibits only want to see routes, rates, and postmarks, and anything else was superfluous. Okay. He said that letters and postcards have been written by one person to another in order to communicate information, and that can be equally, if not more valid in some cases. And you'll see in italics that under the revised FIP Postal History Guidelines written in 2002, a postal history exhibit should generally emphasize rates, routes, regulations, markings, usages, and other postal aspects, services, functions, and activities related to the history and development of postal services. These guidelines are all very good, but could be considered quite sterile, especially to the non-philatelic viewer. I mean, who wrote the letter, why the letter was written, what the contents were, to me and many are of much more interest. And being controversial, probably to the majority of collectors too. I would suggest that the romance of the cover is a lot more interest than what particular rate was used. As Simon said to you, I collect Sarawak, and indeed am known as Mr. Sarawak. So a lot of the examples today will be from my own collection, but not exclusively so. Early covers from Sarawak are extremely scarce. I would suggest it's some of the rarest postal history in the world, and I shall show why in a minute. And I'm also very, very fortunate that in many cases I can find out what the contents of any particular cover were, as nearly every letter from the early years came from the Raja himself or his family, and they're in the family archive, which is in the Bodleian Library. For those that you don't know, Sarawak is in the northwestern seaboard of the island of Borneo and covers an area of about 50,000 square miles, the majority of which is rainforest. To the northeast lies British North Borneo, now Sabah, Brunei and Labuan. The remainder of the country borders Indonesian Borneo, and the capital is Kuching. And for the period of most of my covers, Kuching was Sarawak. The climates of the rainforest, and now this is important because the average temperature of Sarawak at 85 degrees and the humidity is 94%. And this tropical climate causes very real problems with material. To find it in good condition is very, very difficult. Why is Sarawak stuff so scarce? Well, there's references to the population in many history books. And Emily Hahn's biography of James Brooks said that in 1843, there were only 16 Europeans in the country. And by 1871, there were less than a score. And the table on the right shows you that in 1891, there were only 57 Europeans, and Europeans include Australians and Americans. It's just people who are basically Caucasian. And even by 1910, there were only 112. And by the time the Japanese invaded in 1941, there were still only 200 Europeans living there. Remarkable that Brooke actually set up a government with such a small number of men. But from a philatelic point of view, it's therefore unsurprising that any postal history from Sarawak is exceptionally scarce and incoming covers virtually non-existent. And I would suggest that some of the earlier postal history is the rarest in the world. I mean, pre-1868, there were only 23 covers known, and you're going to see 8 or 9 of them now. Right, so I shall start off showing a few slides as if this was a postal history exhibit, okay? Using those FIP guidelines and just concentrating on routes and rates. So this following notice appeared in the Straits Settlement saying that letters and printed matters for the continental Europe via Marseille can be prepaid and not therefore need to be stamped. And there are only 5 of these early pre-stamped covers known. The top one is the earliest recorded date, 26th of January 1858. And we know that the post office was in existence in 1858 because of this particular cover. But before that, in 1857, a Chinese uprising burnt the Raja's property down and all records. So no postal records before 1857-58. Okay. And this particular one has both these have 6 annas, showing that the amount of 6 annas was due. The reason why annas was used from Sarawak at that time, because the middle of 1858, the government of Sarawak entered into an agreement with the postal authorities in Singapore regarding mail between Sarawak and Singapore, an onward transmission. No specific details are known because records are lost, but from January 1859, then adhesive stamps were used. Okay, so here we go. That the only cover known showing a 4 annas rate. This is the second earliest cover known, and it's letter from Charles Johnson, secretary to the second Raja, to Mrs. Harvey, who was the wife of John Harvey, a director of the Borneo Company. And the rate then was 4 annas per quarter ounce from Singapore to England. And that rate was from 1856 to 1862. The next cover shown is, again, showing the rates, 6 annas from India to England via Marseille, and then the 4 anna rate making 10 annas. I show the letters on the right purely to show that these are the letters that I can get to show what was inside this cover, as I said, from the Bodleian Library in Oxford. We then get the Post Office Sarawak cancellation used on stamps. So it was then used as a dispatch mark, and again at the 10 annas rate. This particular cover, as I said, is the earliest cover known, with Post Office Sarawak cancelling the adhesives. So at the moment, I'm concentrating on cancellations, routes, and rates. the change of postal rate from Marseille from 1863 until 1864, where the rate went from 10 annas to 10 annas, 8 pies. You'll notice that all these covers are to Burdett Coutts. I shall come on to Miss Burdett Coutts in a short time. But at the moment, I'm dealing specifically with routes and rates. Then the next cancellation that came in was the square of parallel bars. That's the first proper cancellation of Sarawak that didn't have the name Sarawak on it. This letter's quite unusual though, because although I know it's from the Bishop McDougall, inside the cover on the back of the flap, it actually says from Bishop McDougall, I'm writing this in Labuan, but having to take it to Kuching because Labuan didn't have a post office at this particular time. So I believe this is the earliest piece of mail actually written in Labuan, as well as what it is from Sarawak. I put this one up because it's just lovely. It's the 3-colour franking, and it's perceived to be the finest of all known existing Sarawak covers. As I said, these early covers, there are about 24, 25 known, and I consider this to be the finest of them all. Cancel at the correct rate of 10 annas, 8 pies. The thing is with these early covers, I mean, this is again Post Office Sarawak cover. Why they're so difficult? Because of the 24, 25 known, they're collected not just by Sarawak collectors, they're collected by Straits Settlements collectors, and they're also collected by India collectors. So they're always well sought after when they come to market. We then come on to the earliest known cover with a Sarawak adhesive. Sarawak first issued stamps in 1869 with a picture of the first Raja posthumously because he died the year before. But because they'd done all the proofs and arranged for the printing, they decided to carry on the printing. This is the second issue of Sarawak, which was 1871 issued, but this is the earliest cover known bearing that particular adhesive. You may say, well, after 3 years, how come this is the earliest cover known? If I tell you, we've already told you that there was only a few Europeans in the country, but if I tell you that up until 1869, there were 25 covers known. From 1869 to 1888, there were only 25 covers known. So any early cover is exceptionally scarce. And as I said, this is the earliest cover known. Sarawak to Singapore rate 3 cents. And then from the Singapore rate from Singapore to the UK was 24 cents, making a total of 27 cents. So the 3 cent stamp from a Sarawak and the 24 cent stamp from Straits. And the reason I know the date, because on the back it has a Sarawak double oval cancel showing 31st of December 1874. Here's a great cover, double rate and the first registered covers I've seen. 6 cents because it's double rate to Singapore, and then the 28 cents that's a printed book rate, so 6 cents, and the Singapore to Marseille, 28 cents per half ounce, then a registration fee. Only 2 covers are known bearing that paid cancellation, and even today we're not sure what that paid cancellation is for. I have written an article to the Sarawak Journal with the hypothesis that that was a first ever registration mark cancel. Here's the second cover known bearing that paid cancellation. Again, one of only 2 covers known. I have both in this collection. This case, it went via Brindisi. And so via Brindisi, it was a 16 cents rate plus a Sarawak to Singapore rate, making a total of 19 cents. And then the only cover known with the box registration cancel. All these covers are unique in their own right. Very rare to see it on this issue, but to have it on cover, this is the only one. Again, the rate to Sarawak to Singapore, 3 cents. The Java letter rate from Singapore, 8 cents, making a total of 11 cents. Then in 1888, Sarawak issued stamps from De La Rue. Again, they had to be used in conjunction with a straight settlement stamps because Sarawak didn't join the UPU until July 1897. So we still had to use what we call in the trade combination covers because I had to use a mixture of the Sarawak stamps and the straight stamps. The cover on the left is the 1879 rate, which is a 3-cent Sarawak stamp plus an 8-cent straight stamp to India. And the one on the right is the 1891 rate, which is the rate from Sarawak to Singapore reduced to 2 cents. And then the straight rate to USA was 5 cents. And as I said, Sarawak joined the UPU on the 1st of July 1897. And then the UPU letter rate became 8 cents per half ounce. This cover to the USA bears a triple UPU letter rate of 1897, plus the registration fee of 5 cents, making a total of 29 cents. But you'll note that because it's post 1897, no straight stamps are needed. So, amazing covers, and it shows the route and rate criteria quite well. What it doesn't show, though, it doesn't excite the non-collector, really, because the contents of what might be in it, as far as the postal history exhibit, are totally irrelevant. So the next one, it covers where the cancels and marking tell us stories. So here's a wonderful cover. Only 3 known with this cancel, with the Office of Registry cancel instead of the Post Office Sarawak cancel. Both cancels look very much alike. So why would the clerk, and it was just someone in the employ of the Raja, use the wrong cancel? Well, one can only assume that the night before he'd had too much to drink, probably came to his office in the morning, and by mistake put the wrong cancel on those particular stamps. As I said, only 3 covers are known. 2 have the same arrival date in London, and one is to Miss Brown, Angela Burdett Coote's companion, and this one's into Miss Burdett Coote's herself, both from the Raja. What that cancellation should have been used for was land registry documents and also on banknotes. And that banknote you see, that very, very scruffy banknote you see, is actually worth more than the cover, purely and solely as the earliest banknote known from Sarawak. This is quite fun to some of our American friends. I was meant to be a leading authority on all early covers from Sarawak, and have known for a while that, as I said, covers bearing the 1871 issue and 1875 issue are very scarce. But I came across this cover, USS Brooklyn from Sarawak, Borneo, to the Postal family in Philadelphia. So I did some research on this because this is really quite unusual. Okay, and you'll read there that the cover was posted from the USS Brooklyn. It was the first of 5 screw sloops. From US Naval Records, I found out the USS Brooklyn sailed from New York on the 12th of August 1886, calling briefly at Sarawak in 1887. I also found out that the Bonsall family were one of the most respected families in Philadelphia, so this cover almost certainly came from one of the ship's officers. This cover's rather fun, just a British cover into Sarawak. But why? Why does it have all these markings on the back? It's addressed to Baron R.A. Villard, who was the Inspector General of Customs in Shanghai. What he was doing in Sarawak at the time, I don't know. I still haven't been able to find out. But the back, the translation says, item has been passed after military checked. And this is probably the Imperial Qing military taking measures to limit the supporting movement of Sun Yat-sen's revolution with overseas Chinese in Sarawak and other southeastern nations. The letter originally to Shanghai redirected Sarawak and must have actually aroused a suspicion of the Qing military. Probably the earliest censored cover relating to Sarawak. Again, much more fun finding out why it was sent, who it was sent to, some of the markings that aren't necessarily routes and rates. This is the earliest incoming cover addressed to Sarawak, to William Brereton. Now, William Brereton arrived in Sarawak at the tender age of 15. The Rajah of Sarawak was known to like having young midshipmen and young boys to work in his civil service. But can you imagine sending your son to the other side of the world at the age of 15? William was the son of Reverend Brereton, who was a relation of James Brooke. He came as a midshipman on a ship and decided to leave the Navy and join Brooke. He was also the great nephew of the Bishop of Calcutta, and this letter from Calcutta is written by the bishop. And as I said, the earliest piece of incoming mail addressed to Sarawak. And here's another cover, incoming cover, to William Brereton. Carl Louis of Cornfilla had a listing of all early covers going from UK to other destinations in the world. And when I first got in touch with them many years ago, he only had 2 or 3 covers from Sarawak listed. I think I now have about 20 incoming covers from the UK, but this is one of them. It's cancelled at the Indian close rate of 1 shilling and 10 pence. But what's more important, after he first arrived in Sarawak, Brereton became the first European officer ever to be stationed outside Kuching. As a young officer aged 20, he was dispatched to the Scrang Fort. And he lived in the Scrang Fort in the middle of the rainforest for nearly 3 years, without any other European officer nearby. However, the Rajah did allow him to take a native wife, which probably helped during the lonely nights stuck in the rainforest. And after 3 years, he was sent an assistant called Lee, who we know lost his life fairly quickly after arrival in a skirmish with the Scrang Iban pirates. Brereton died just at the age of 24 from dysentery and is buried in the Brook Cemetery in Kuching. And I've had the honour to actually go to his grave. Having access to contents of covers does help. Okay, so this cover here was previously owned by Gilbert Wheat. And when Gilbert Wheat, the great postal historian, sold his collection through Cavendish, this cover was on the front cover of that particular catalogue, and it was Gilbert's favourite cover, I was told. The contents are the important bit about this cover, because it's to the Rajah Mudda, called Captain Brooke, the Rajah's nephew. And it's almost certainly the reply to the letter written by him to the Rajah saying that he was going to take over the country because the Rajah, Sir James Brooke, was in England at the time. And he didn't like the fact that he'd heard that the Rajah was trying to sell Sarawak. So he announced to him in the previous letter, which he'd written, that he was going to take over the country. And this is a letter that the Rajah wrote back saying, not on your Nelly, chum, I'm on my way out to disinherit you. Interestingly, I said that the Rajah was thinking of selling the country. He was trying to sell the country to either France or Belgium. And can you imagine if he'd sold to Belgium, that probably Patrick Marcellis would be giving this particular lecture now, not me. This is quite fun. This is a letter, again, from the Rajah, Sir James Brooke, to Baroness Burdett Coutts. Now, I've mentioned to you that the Rajah was quite fond of young midshipmen, and there's been many books written over the years suggesting that Rajah Brooke was probably a homosexual. Now, this is all supposition and conjecture, and there is no evidence to suggest that a Victorian man had any relations with young boys apart from he liked that company, until I found this letter. And I think this letter probably, without any reasonable doubt, suggests that Rajah Brooke was probably homosexual, because what Victorian man would actually write a letter to Baroness Burdett Coutts where he talks of papering the walls of his house using the paper he bought in Bath? I can't imagine that most chaps in Victorian times actually want to discuss the colour of his wallpaper, unless, of course, the books might be right. The joy in researching the cover brings the cover to life. I love researching covers, and this particular case study next looks at taking one cover and developing a hypothesis based on research that you know is right. So I bought this cover a while back, okay, and it's addressed to Captain Bethune, RN, Commander of the Bath, Borneo or elsewhere, Singapore. Now, I knew the name Bethune, and I was convinced that this cover was sent to Bethune in Sarawak. It's sent at the Indian closed letter rate at £1.10. You can see it's got a Charing Cross paid mark on it, and it was sent on the 4th of February. Also has a Bombay ship letter. Was it to Sarawak? I wanted to prove it was. Remember, it was sent on the 4th of February. Okay? Mail to this particular time was taken 3 to 4 months by sail. And we know that until June 1845, all mail went by sail. I mean, we know that the Lady Mary Wood was the first mail steamer dispatched to Southeast Asia. It arrived in Singapore on the 4th of August, 1845. So this mail was sent before then. Okay? And the Lady Wood actually the Mary Wood didn't actually start its voyage till the 24th of June. So this didn't apply to this particular letter. So it's safe to make an assumption that this would get to Captain Bethune sometime between late April and June 1845. But where was he? In Keppel's book, Admiral Keppel's book, Expedition to Borneo, it actually states, and you can see there, that on February the 25th, Captain Bethune joined his boat. So we know on February the 25th, he was picked up by a naval boat, an RN ship, by Captain Keppel. In Spencer St. John's book about Raja Brooke, he actually says Captain Bethune arrived in February in HMS Driver and brought with him the temporary appointment of Brooke as Her Majesty's confidential agent. So we've got him with the Raja, okay, in February. We know, as I said, that he joined them. Keppel's book also includes extracts from James Brooke's journals, and on the 12th of March from Labuan, Brooke writes the following, that he's with Captain Bethune on that island. Okay, so where was Brooke at the critical period of that letter being delivered? In Captain Monday's book, he actually states on the 21st of May, he went from Labuan to Brunei, and then he returned to Sarawak. So in May, he's returning to Sarawak at the end of May. And I also found an eyewitness account saying in July 1845, he was in Sarawak with Mr. Brooke, okay, before leaving on the 24th of July. I also knew that Captain Bethune had painted pictures of the Raja's bungalow in Sarawak. And I found out that those pictures were actually at Yale University. And that particular picture, painted by Captain Bethune, of a sketch of the Raja's bungalow, was July 1845. So I know that Bethune went to Sarawak in May and he was still there in July. That's when this picture was painted. So I believe now that with all reasonable doubt, this innocuous little letter has great historical significance as being the earliest piece of incoming mail, which is also the earliest piece of mail either in or out of Sarawak at this particular time. And to me, this one little cover and all the research that I've done epitomizes the romance of a cover as opposed to just to its £1 shilling and 10p rate and the route that it might have taken in a closed mail bag to Singapore. The next two covers relate to the same very historical, important event. The first one is another cover of mine to Lieutenant Pascoe, HM Brig Royalist, Singapore, East Indies. And from my research, I knew that the Royalist was off the coast of Sarawak, Borneo at the time, and I know that the rate was a shilling from Southampton, etc. What's really important, though, that letter to Lieutenant Pascoe is sent by his father, Admiral John Pascoe. When Admiral John Pascoe was a young lieutenant, he was a signal lieutenant to Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. And he was the actual signal lieutenant that raised the signal that England expects, etc., etc. So romantically, that cover links back to the Battle of Trafalgar. And then speaking to Keith Brandon said, I've got something related to the Battle of Trafalgar. Would you like to use it? Now, here is a pre-stamp cover dated 1805 that one wouldn't normally give much of a second glance to unless you were collecting that particular sort of area, you know, going from Trieste to Livorno. The endorsement on the back, forwarded by KK Austrian Consul General, 15th of October. The transit hand stamp. We don't really know whether the letter continued by sea or overland, etc. So not a very exciting cover to unless you collect that particular area until you know its contents. And its contents are this, which is quite remarkable. It suggests, that we know that Collingwood's fleet encountered the combined fleets of France and Spain. Returning to Cadiz, he blockaded the port using false signals to disguise the small size of his fleet until he was joined by Nelson's ships. The enemy was lured out of Cadiz and the Battle of Trafalgar ensued. But this particular notice actually says, and I'm trying to read it, to the Imperial and Royal Vice Consul in Barcelona, Signor Carlo Berzoni, acting Imperial and Royal Consul General in Cadiz, reports on the 23rd July last that the English Admiral Collingwood has declared by notice dispatched on the 19th to the consuls of the national powers that the ports of Cadiz and St. Luke will be under a strict blockade so that all ships that might venture to leave or cover these ports and cargo will be stopped and declared prize, etc. What a wonderful item, because it links absolutely to the battle of just before the Battle of Trafalgar. So romantically, this little cover is absolutely superb. I mean, again, the contents, which you're not allowed to show normally in a postal history exhibit, are much more important than the cover itself. I'll go back to that just to see that was actually, as I said, the contents of that particular cover. But wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I thank Keith for letting me use it. So to reiterate about routes and rates versus the romance of the cover. Now, going back to Sarawak, this particular cover, again, a combination cover, 2 cents rate, 8 cents straight settlement stamp, dated March the 1st to James Heath, Managing Director of Perkins Bacon. Now, that particular issue of Sarawak stamps in 1895, that's meant to be it's the 1894 rate, but the cover's February 1895. That particular issue of stamps was issued in January 1895 by mistake, because there was an 1888 Delaro issue and an 1899 Delaro issue, and the Treasurer of Sarawak was on leave to England for a year, and the Assistant Treasurer was running out of stamps, and mistakenly, and I don't know how he could make such a mistake, he realised that Perkins Bacon printed the banknotes at the time of Sarawak, so he sent a letter to Perkins Bacon, could you please print us some stamps? Perkins Bacon rubbed their hands with glee, because they know they weren't the printers of Sarawak stamps. They never sent out any proofs to Sarawak at that time. They just got on and printed it and sent the stamps to Sarawak. So we have this one particular issue of Perkins Bacon, a one-off issue. But what's wonderful about this, besides being the earliest cover known bearing that adhesive, that issue of stamps, it is to James Heath, Managing Director of Perkins Bacon. And for those of you who know, the Perkins Bacon records sit at the Royal Philatelic Society. And going to the Royal and going through the records, I actually found out that the Royal not only had the contents, which was to actually pay the invoice of £90, 5 shillings and threepence to the, from Charles Pearce, the Treasurer of Sarawak, to James Heath, the Managing Director of Perkins Bacon. Not only the letter, but a copy of the cheque that was enclosed was also in the archives in the Royal. So that little letter there, which is rather nice, has much more relevance when you actually know the contents. It makes the contents much more romantic, in my view, than just the route and rates. So what's the horror of the cover? This is a particular prisoner of war mail from Sarawak to Captain Yates, from Captain Yates, who was in the Batu Lintang camp in Sarawak during the Second World War. And we all know the horrors of POW camps during the Second World War. What I particularly like about this little postcard, which the Japanese made all the prisoners write a postcard home, and they decided, wouldn't it be nice if we said it was Christmas Day in the camp? Yates was having none of this. And if you read the back of the card, dearest mother, happy Easter to everyone. I'm fairly fit. Hope everyone at home. So he wasn't having none of it. Luckily, the Japanese censors didn't spot what he was doing. So the card was dated Christmas Day and he wrote Happy Easter. What's really quite worrying is in his diary, he wrote 3 times a year in September, December, and May, we were permitted to send a 24-word postcard home. But so far as I can make out, this was largely window dressing and most of the cards never left Kuching. He was overly pessimistic, as I know that 4 of the 8 cards he eventually wrote were sent and eventually reached home. The other 4 were probably lost in transit. But this is rather nice, isn't it? Happy Easter when it was Christmas Day and the Japanese never spotted it. In-depth knowledge also helps when you are doing looking at romance of covers. This particular cover I found and realised straight away it was from the Raja of Sarawak. I know his handwriting, the 3rd Raja of Sarawak. And after the Second World War, after the Japanese occupation, the Raja returned to Sarawak, and you'll see that there were no regular flights, but just a flight run by RAF Sunderland flying boats. And I put the rate for the cover, a 55 cents rate. But what's more poignant is the news of cessation came, and he returned to Sarawak on the 15th of April. And at the council, he told the Council Negri, which was basically the government running Sarawak at the time, which consisted of Dayaks and Chinese and Malays, that he was selling the country to Great Britain, which he did. And this was almost certainly the last letter written by the Raja from Sarawak, because it was the 9th of May and he left on the 17th of May. So having a little bit of local knowledge does help when one's researching covers. Again, another one which is an enormous amount of fun, this coronation issue throughout the Commonwealth and the Empire was issued on the 2nd of June 1953. And there was a slight element many years ago of why it wasn't issued in Sarawak until the following day. 2nd of June across the Empire, but 3rd of June in Sarawak, and actually North Borneo for that matter. Until I found this cover, and you look at the contents. And Mrs. Buck, wife of the chairman of the Kuching municipality, explains in this letter why Sarawak did not issue the coronation stamps until the following day. It says that the pity our Postmaster General did not see fit to issue our stamps on the 2nd, But he said, what with school parades, United Services, etc., people would be far too busy to go to the post office, and neither he nor the Postmaster General North Borneo thought it was necessary to make their staff work overtime on a national holiday. So the whole of Malaya was issuing them, but I gather from my mother that England was issuing stamps on Coronation Day, but the post office would be closed that day. Sounds a bit Irish to me. But now we know through the contents of the cover why Sarawak issued their stamps one day later than the rest of the empire. Even the most mundane cover can have a story. And a friend of mine who's a fellow of the Royal, Jeremy Dixon, actually, as a bit of fun, buys covers off eBay for not a lot of money, 20, 30 pound, and then researches them. And this is one that he found, and it's an absolutely innocuous little cover, 1 penny cover. There are many of them about. But once you research the cover, you'll actually see, what he's done. A plain little cover. He's found out who it was sent by, who it was to, and that particular estate, what it consisted of. Okay. That the Broomhill estate covered 2,500 acres, a main house, several other properties, when it was constructed, when it was remodeled, and then found out that it was the family seat of the Earls of Elgin and Kincardine, who were the Bruce family, whose ancestors were King Robert the Bruce, who was a visitor at Bannockburn. In 1842, the owner was James Bruce, who was greatly impoverished by selling the family fortune by his purchase of the Elgin marbles. So we've gone from Robert the Bruce, Bannockburn, and the Elgin marbles. And then he died through a heart attack brought on by overexertion. But one little cover in a postal history exhibit would be nothing. But when you look at the romance of the cover, look how much you can find out. Some covers take you a completely tangential area of collecting. I came across this cover. It's the earliest known cover, or I thought it was the earliest known cover, from Sarawak. Frinton-on-Sea, where I live, wasn't actually built till 1902. And this was the earliest cover I'd known. I was very excited because those of you know, Alan Moorcroft, the ex-president of the Royal, is a specialist on East Anglian postal history. And I was very, very excited that I had this cover. And I told him about it, and blow me down, a couple of months later, he found an earlier one, which he found on Delcamp for £4. Okay? But doing our research, a pair of us, we found out that they were from a guy called Paul de Bramaker to his parents in Brussels. And he was thought to have been in Frinton in 1901 and involved in experiments being carried out by the Marconi School of Wireless Telegraphy. Messages were transmitted by the Marconi station in Le Pen, Belgium, and De Brecker became on to be a director of the telephone company. The particular house where the Marconi School of Telegraphy is literally 100 yards from where I live. And there's a picture of what it was like before the war, and there's a picture of what it looks like now. What's interesting, one could say that discussing radio signals in 1901, did the terminology of radio waves be used because he lived next to the sea? You could only smile at that one. So how can this one cover take you into congenital forms of collecting? This is addressed to Thomas Allen in Frinton-on-Sea from Sarawak. So a cover from Sarawak I collect to Frinton-on-Sea where I live. Wonderful. Who was Thomas Allen? Now, Thomas Allen was one of the great stamp dealers between the war. And in fact, Thomas Allen was the stamp dealer to King George V. Okay? And King George V actually sent him out to buy stamps for King George V when he went to buy stamps from the Ferrari collection. And I know, and I'll come on to it in a second, that King George V gave him £10 per week expenses whilst he was buying stamps from the Ferrari collection. But besides King George V, one of Thomas Allen's great clients was King Carol of Romania, who was an eminent stamp collector of the time. And here's a wonderful cover to Thomas Allen Frinton from King Carol's private secretary, saying the stamp in the envelope on the envelope being al dente, in other words, no perforations, is a great philatelic rarity. And I have found out from Romanian collectors it's an enormous philatelic rarity. And so from King Carol, from where he lived, Casa Regalui, to Thomas Allen at Frinton. Again, wonderful cover, has a lot of history about it. And here's another one to Thomas Allen from King Carol, Romania in 1938. Interesting, the cover's dated 12th of September 1938 from Romania to Frinton, and there is a copy of Thomas Allen's reply and the registered receipt of his reply 4 days later. It would take 3 weeks to get a cover from Romania to Frinton these days, and in 1938 it took 4 days. Absolutely wonderful items. And lastly, Thomas Allen from Prince Frederick of I won't pronounce it, dated 10th of November 1953. Gorgeous cover, very rare set to find on cover, with a letter from the Prince. The cover itself, someone would consider quite philatelic, but when you take the contents as well, it's a beautiful, beautiful cover. A quick history of Thomas Allen there. Became a stamp dealer to the King. I've mentioned the Perkins-Bacon archives. Charles Nissen and he bought the Perkins-Bacon archive and then presented it or sold it to the Royal. And he came to Frinton to live in 1936. And I now collect all Thomas Allen items. Anything I see, I now buy. Interesting story there in the first paragraph. When Edward VIII became king, there was a rumour that the royal collection would be sold. Thomas Allen went into Coutts and asked if he could write a cheque for 500,000. That says £5,000. It's £500,000, not 5,000, but £500,000, which was a huge amount in those days. They said yes. So he went to the palace to buy the royal collection. Luckily, King George V realised what was going on and entailed the royal collection, because he knew that if it was sold, that Edward VIII and his woman would spend all the money. When Sir John Wilson retired as keeper of the royal collection, Thomas Allen was offered the position, but he was 70 at the time and felt he was much too old. But a lot of the items in the royal collection were purchased on behalf of the king by him. That's a nice little box I found of stamp hinges. And there's his obituary when he died November the 21st, 1984. So, coming to conclusion, letters are still important to me. Imagine you get a note through the door that could contain, this time of year, an OBE or a CBE, or tells you the death of a family member. I mean, I still send handwritten letters. Whenever I go out for lunch with someone or dinner with someone, I send a handwritten letter. I send notes to my grandchildren and I put the stamp relevant to the occasion on them. And I love receiving handwritten notes. But can you imagine in 100 years' time if there was a letter that I wrote thanking someone for lunch, and someone in 100 years' time picked up the cover with the contents inside? Would they ask, what were they talking about? What do they talk about? What do they eat? Or would they just say, good, that cover was sent at £1.70 and travelled from Frinton to London through the sorting office in Chelmsford? I hope this potpourri of a few covers that I've shown you shows that history of the cover can be much more interesting, the postal aspect, to a postal historian. I fundamentally believe that, and I hope that I've persuaded many of you with the same. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Simon. Mr. Richards, do you wish to say anything at this point?
Well, thank you very much, Simon. Absolutely splendid. Some marvellous anecdotes there. Um, though I confess one of my questions is I noticed the Sarawak stamps are always placed to the left of the Straits Settlement stamps.
Yes.
And yeah, that's quite interesting.
You could buy straight settlement stamps in Sarawak.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. And you put that on first, and there was the instruction to do it that way round.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. But no, some lovely anecdotes. You've slightly led the audience on, so I don't know that a straw poll would be totally objective. But Mark, do we have any questions in the chat?
The only question we had with regard to some of the early slides you were saying, Simon, where you were describing obviously rates, routes, and so on, and markings. There was a question from Julian Jones who asked, let me just find the question again, that your early slides didn't include the routes so much. You were absolutely focusing on the stamps and the hence the rates, but he wondered whether this was because it was difficult in finding the shipping schedules for that time period. I think 1860 through 1866. So
I do have by going through the Straits Times, I can tell what ships were leaving at what particular time, and I could if I went to that level of detail, and I do have it in my archives. But mine's a traditional exhibit, not a postal history exhibit. So just to show the route and the rates, and the routes were at that particular time either via Southampton or via Marseille. So there was only two routes. I showed a Brindisi cover. That's because it was going to Italy. That's why it went via Brindisi. But there were only two routes, Marseille and Southampton, at that particular time.
I see. Thank you. To answer your question, Simon, that was the only question that was in the chat, unless someone snuck one in while we've been talking. No,
Right.
that was the only question we had.
Do you want to then? Have we got a certificate? I should have asked you earlier, but
we do. We have one with your autograph on it.
Splendid, good. One I signed earlier.
So
shall we present that, and we can draw the formal part of the meeting, and then we can open up to less formal chat if anybody feels they don't quite want to put it formally, but can ask a question informally.
Absolutely. So let me just get that on the screen for us. Here we go.
There we go. There's the certificate. I dare say you can probably collect the original on Thursday. But thank you very much from all of us. It's very good if you just step in. And actually, the world is probably a better place because this talk is now recorded. Because as you say, that Stuart Roster lecture has had some demand. So it will now be available on the Royal's YouTube channel. Is that right, Mark?
That is correct, yes.
You will come back to it all later.
Absolutely.
Very good to see 120 something participants, which is a number I don't remember seeing for a very long time indeed, if ever. No. So well done, Simon. You've clearly hit a note there that appeals. Thank you very much.